Well, thank you, David. Thank you for that very nice introduction. Welcome, everyone. It's really a pleasure for me to be here today as part of the ISACA conference. As you heard, my name is Leroy Chiao, and I'm an astronaut. Over my 15-year NASA career, I did get to fly 4 times into space. My first 3 missions were aboard space shuttles, and on my 4th flight, I trained with the Russians, launched aboard a Soyuz rocket out of the Baikonur Cosmodrome in Kazakhstan, and flew to the International Space Station, where I served as the commander and NASA science officer during Expedition 10, which was a 6.5-month flight. I started my professional life as a chemical engineer. I have 3 degrees in chemical engineering, but my real passion was spaceflight. I've always loved airplanes and rockets and followed those early missions with a lot of interest. And as you just heard, besides being my heroes, the early astronauts, people like Alan Shepard, today is National Astronauts Day and happens to be the 60th anniversary of Alan Shepard becoming the first American to go fly into space. I was inspired to want to become an astronaut by the Apollo 11 moon landing mission. And so that was just almost 52 years ago that happened. But I remember it like it was yesterday as an 8-year-old kid. And so I worked really hard and was fortunate enough to be selected. And then many years later, actually got to go fly into space myself. During my space missions, I got to do a variety of different kinds of things. I got to do research work in space, of course, and also did spacewalks, did EVAs, what we call extravehicular activities, in both American and in Russian spacesuits, all in support of the design and construction of the International Space Station. After those missions, as I mentioned before, I did train with the Russians, and flying aboard a Russian Soyuz rocket was quite a different experience than flying aboard an American shuttle. But in either case, you get up into low Earth orbit in about 9 minutes, up to our orbital speed of about 17,500 miles an hour. After docking to the ISS, we did spend 6.5 months up there before returning back down in the Soyuz capsule back to Earth. After leaving NASA, I got involved with different kinds of organizations, a lot of technology companies, some startups. Also have a couple of academic appointments that I stay busy with. And so I've gotten to see a lot of different leadership types of structures and been a part of those structures. And so I have some insights that I've gleaned from a lot of those experiences to kind of share with you. I also want to talk about operational decision making. This really is a way of thinking. It was something that was drilled into us at NASA, and anyone with a flying background will know what I'm talking about. But these lessons definitely apply to all kinds of different facets of life. In fact, you might end up making your friends sick of you because you're always optimizing and thinking operationally. But it's a mindset that I think you'll find is useful. Well, the first thing I want to talk about leadership is, how do you pick up these leadership tips? Well, of course, it's from experience. And one of the best ways to learn how to be a leader is to look at people who are in those positions and learn what not to do. Right? We've all dealt with people before in leadership positions. Perhaps they're a little bit arrogant, or they're a bit non-communicative, or they steal other people's ideas. Those are traits that you learn quickly don't work out for you in the long run. Similarly, a lot of people, unfortunately, a lot of leaders avoid conflict. They make decisions by avoiding conflict, and that really is a big mistake. If you avoid the conflict and ignore it, all it does is fester, and people become non-communicative. The stress builds up, and pretty soon your organization becomes pretty dysfunctional. As an example, what happens if a member of your team isn't pulling his weight? Okay, if you're making a decision about not being confrontational, you might decide to pick up that work yourself and get it done. But what are the other members of your team going to think of you? And what is this person who's been slacking off going to think? So, well, this is great. I can get away with this, right? The only worst thing you could do is decide to give that work to one of your performing team members. And, just think about the resentment that's going to cause. And, pretty soon your organization is going to be dysfunctional as well. Well, another big mistake leaders have is that they think their job is to manage the system or the process. Even at organizations like NASA, I can remember many times being in meetings where a fairly senior leader has come out and said, our biggest job is to manage the process and to make sure that we follow the process. And sometimes I've had to correct them, say, no, actually our job is to make sure the astronauts have the tools and resources they need to successfully and safely get into space, complete their missions, and then return safely to Earth. Leaders lead people. That's something that oftentimes gets forgotten in the day-to-day, but leaders, you have to step back and realize that your job is to lead people, to build teams. No systems or processes ever built teams that I know of. One of the greatest leaders of our modern time, in my opinion, is General Norman Schwarzkopf. And he kind of boiled it down to a few key words. He says leaders have to have character, they have to have integrity, and most importantly, you always have to be willing to do the right thing. Now think about that, being willing to do the right thing no matter what the cost. Most of the time, we all know what the right thing to do is, but sometimes going down that path can be difficult because perhaps there are consequences. But you know, if you stay true to your beliefs and to what's important, then your teams are going to respect you and you're going to continue to be successful. Leaders, of course, have to set the vision for the organization, and they have to lead by example. Set those high standards and follow those high standards as an example to your employees. You have to empower your employees, of course. You know, you have to give responsibility to your teams, let them make decisions and own those decisions, and that's how you're going to have the most effective organization. So the rub is, in this culture, the leadership, of course, sets the culture. Operational rigor is very important. Places like NASA, or if you're running a chemical plant or a nuclear plant, you've got to have that operational rigor where everyone is adhering to the standard procedures and not deviating from them without some very good reasons. But then the other piece of that is, how do you maintain that culture, but then again, allow people to innovate and to experiment and to even fail? Right? And so you want to be able to stay on top. You have to encourage a culture of both, where when it's appropriate, you can deviate from the written procedures and you can try new things and you don't get punished for taking a risk and perhaps having it not work out. Now, you people are all computer and software folks, and I don't need to tell you about the internet. It wasn't that long ago. In fact, when I was in university, you know, there was something called the ARPANET, and which developed later into the internet. So it hasn't been that long ago that the internet really wasn't around in everyone's lives. And just imagine what life would be now without it, right? And so without the freedom to do things like develop new software, again, on the shuttle side and spacecraft, the software is absolutely controlled, absolutely tested very rigorously, because it has to work. We can't have a freeze up of a spacecraft while it's in flight. But on the other hand, we have to kind of keep evolving and keep moving forward and trying new things to develop and improve things as we go on. One other principle that General Schwarzkopf absolutely demanded is said, you know, you've got to be able to get the straight, skinny, the data on what's going on. He says, you can't shoot the messenger. You can't punish the person giving you bad news. He said, how am I going to win this war if I don't have the real thing about what's going on? I need to be able to be told bad news so that I can make the appropriate decisions. At the same time, on the other side, you want to recognize your people when they're performing well and take care of them as well. Communication is one of the key features that you have to have as a leader. In fact, the higher up you go in leadership, the more important this becomes, to be able to communicate the message not only down to the troops below you, but also up to the board above you. And so you have to be able to clearly articulate the goals, make sure every team member understands his or her role, every group is pulling together in the right direction, and that's where the rub comes in. You know, communication, people now, and we're working more and more internationally than ever, and this conference is a great example of that. You know, the next generation is going to be even more connected around the world. So we're dealing with people from different cultures, different countries, different backgrounds and things like that. People come in all shapes and sizes and colors, and you know, the problem is, the way we communicate effectively with one group or culture doesn't necessarily work with another, right? For example, we Americans, we tend to be pretty direct, right? And that works well for us, but maybe it doesn't work well with someone from a different background. The world is shrinking, and it's technology that's shrinking it. Not that long ago, we didn't have smartphones. You know, I mean, to the younger folks, of course, you grew up always having smartphones, but for those of us a little older, we remember operating without these kinds of devices, but they really have connected us all around the world, and it's going to continue to shrink. Let me give you a little background about my own upbringing. I was born in the United States, but my parents were both originally from China, in the area outlined in red in Shandong province in northern China. My father was from a small farming community on the western side of the province, and my mother was from the beautiful port city of Qingdao on the other side. And so Qingdao, of course, it was a German port. There was a German colony there. The Chinese, you know, they've been brewing good beer for probably about 3,000 years, and now Qingdao beer is you know, world famous for its name, and it's actually a very good beer. Like I said, the Chinese have been brewing beer probably for about 3,000 or so years, but they've only been brewing good beer for a few hundred years, ever since the Germans showed up and showed them how to do it right. If you go to Qingdao today, you'll still see a lot of the German architecture on the government buildings, the red tiled roofs, and still a very beautiful port city. After the war, my parents found themselves on the island of Taiwan, and they were young teenagers back then, and they met each other at university some years later. They got married, and my older sister was actually born on Taiwan. I was born in the United States in Milwaukee, not too far from here, and this is a picture of me in my first spacesuit of sorts. Well, I think growing up with one foot in each different culture, I grew up in mainstream America, but my parents very much kept the Chinese culture at home, really gave me an advantage because it gave me that difference in perspective. And that helped me get through some of the difficult parts of my time, including getting through my undergraduate degree at the University of California at Berkeley, which is still the single hardest thing I've ever had to do in my life. But it also got me to NASA. And this is my NASA astronaut class. We were Group 13, selected in 1990. You can see that we come from all across the country. We're a mixture of men and women, people from different heritages and different cultures. But no matter whether you're putting a team together to go up into space or you're putting a team together in your boardroom, you all know already it's the people that are going to make or break you. Right? And so, as I mentioned before, understanding those cultural differences, not so much from a sensitivity standpoint, even though that's important, but more from a practical standpoint of being able to effectively communicate with those people, that's what's going to give you your highest performing team, and that's what's going to keep you ahead in your business negotiations and in your business place in your industry. I myself was fortunate enough to fly every one of my space missions with international astronauts, including people like Chiaki Mukai, who was the very first Japanese woman to fly into space. I trained with European astronauts like Jean-Jacques Favier, a French astronaut who went on to fly his own shuttle mission some years later, and then went on to become a senior official in the French Space Agency. And of course, with my Russian experience, I've spent a lot of time in Russia, the better part of 3.5 years. Half of that time, 1 month in Star City outside of Moscow, 1 month back in the U.S., back and forth for 3.5 years. I got to know that culture very well. Some of the parts of those cultures were a little more challenging to assimilate than others, but I sure did have a very rich experience with that. Well, talking about shifting gears a little bit, I want to talk about operational decision making. And as I mentioned before, this really is kind of a way of thinking. And the first thing you do in operational decision making is you figure out how much time you have to make that decision, because there are going to be reactions to your actions, right? There are going to be consequences to what your decision, how you make your decision. And so being engineers, we all want to have the data, but on the other side of that is you're never going to have all the information, so you've got to make your decision in a timely manner based on what you know, what you've learned, and also on trusting your instincts, trusting your gut. 9 times out of 10, that will steer you in the right direction, and making the wrong decision is better than not making a decision at all. Sometimes you don't have much time to react, and so you have to know some of these, what we call the bold-faced procedures. For example, ejecting from an aircraft, there's no time to pull out a checklist. You just have to memorize how to go through those things, and deciding very quickly, sometimes within a second, could make the difference of saving your own life. Well, since you are all computer and software people, I want to take a moment and talk about cloud computing, one of the technologies that's not that new here. But, I don't have to tell you again just how enabling and transformative cloud computing is making our, all these different aspects of our lives, right? And so cloud computing, for example, of course, is basically an almost infinitely scalable computing system there in the network. And it's going to enable things like separating automatic flying cars sometime in the future, right? But one example that I want to talk about is training. The cloud computing and the advances in software have really advanced the state of the art of training. And training is so important for everything that we do, not only at NASA and for spaceflight, but in every industry. You want to look at training as something that you're continually doing. You don't think about, well, I don't need to go learn new things anymore, right? You're always learning new things, which is why you're part of this conference. And so that's going to keep building that foundation for you, and that's what's going to help you deal with unexpected things, and I'll give you some examples of that. On the other side of that, of course, these advances in computers and software have helped organizations like NASA have state-of-the-art simulators that we can use to train our astronauts and other people to do their jobs. But sometimes, the old-fashioned way is actually better. So just because you can do something doesn't necessarily that you should. And you really need to pick and choose, what is going to work most effectively. An example of that is, NASA, of course, tries to keep up with the latest in training capabilities. And so we long ago went away from the whiteboards and the blackboards and went to PowerPoints and computer-based training and things like that. But then when I started training in Russia and started learning about their systems, I was reminded of my own elementary school days and sitting at a desk and a teacher lecturing on the chalkboard and then having to write notes. Now, I relearned that when you have to write your own notes, you really learn it. You really learn it well, and later on when you're reviewing for an exam or before you go fly, reading through your own notes is much more effective than looking through a PowerPoint deck. And so it's a blend of the old and the new, and so you got to keep that in mind, and that's another part of this operational thinking. Of course, as I mentioned, training and operational thinking is key to being effective and safe in flying aircraft, flying spacecraft, and doing just about anything else that is high risk and high value. Let me give you a personal example. So for training for spacewalks, we train in our spacesuits underwater in water tanks. And this allows us to go through, each spacewalk is typically planned for about 6.5 hours. It allows us to go through and rehearse everything that we're going to do until we have it pretty much down in our memory. We do follow by the checklist, but typically when we were building the space station, we would train crews around 10 hours in the water for every hour they would actually be spending out doing spacewalks. So on my third mission, we were the second major assembly mission of the space station. One of our critical tasks was setting up the data link between the space station and the ground. And so that involved installing this antenna dish, the KU band antenna. By the way, this is still the main data link between the station and the ground. So all the high data rate stuff that you see coming down, things like video, data from the experiments, and some of the vehicle telemetry, all through this antenna, through the satellite system down to the ground. And so we installed the antenna dish when this boom was folded over the surface of what we call the Z1 truss. And it was critical that we could get it unfolded so that, number one, that the antenna could point towards the satellite, but number two, the very next space shuttle mission was bringing up the first big solar array, the American solar array that was going to mount right on top of that Z1 truss. And so part of the procedure was to take a tool called the portable foot restraint and for me to plug it into a socket so that I could put my feet in it and use both hands to unfold that boom. Well, when I went to plug in that tool, there was a hard metal-to-metal interference. Somehow, through all the checks and balances, that got missed, and this tool was not going to go into the socket. And so, the ground was all, a Twitter about it and talking about it, and I knew, oh my goodness, if we just sit here and just keep waiting, we're going to run out of time. The spacesuits only have so much oxygen, so much battery power, and then if we don't get this thing unfolded, then the next mission can't come up and do their mission. And so, because I had trained so much, I knew I could improvise with another tool that I used. It's called a body restraint tether. It's kind of a soft anchoring thing with a jaw you could clamp onto a handrail. That freed up both my hands, and I could kind of isometrically open that boom and get it bolted down into place. And before the ground came back, I called down and told them we had gotten the job done. And so, being able to fall back on your training, you're going to be surprised, but that training is going to allow you to improvise on the fly and make those decisions in time to save the mission. Another important aspect of operational decision making is keeping the big picture, keeping the perspective. And one thing we say in flying, always, always, always fly the airplane. Don't forget to fly the airplane. There are examples of entire flight crews that got distracted working some kind of a minor problem in the cockpit, and the airplane actually flew itself down into the ground without anyone noticing. It's hard to believe, but it can happen. And I'll give you an example of that. This is one of the most important operational lessons I ever learned. You hear it, and you read about it, but until I lived it, I really hadn't learned it well enough. So NASA, of course, maintains fleets of aircraft that we fly for proficiency and to kind of keep that operational decision making and crew coordination fresh in our minds. So we were flying a Citation jet one day, and there was a command pilot in the left seat, a co-pilot in the right seat, and I was on this sortie. I was was the flight engineer in the center seat. So my job was to look over the front two pilots, look over their shoulders and make sure they weren't missing anything. So it was a beautiful day. We were down in kind of southwest Louisiana, and we were just going to shoot approaches, practice approaches at an airport there. The weather was beautiful. The command pilot was looking out the window, kind of distracted, not really paying attention. The co-pilot was flying the airplane, and so I was looking at the approach plate into which the airport we were going into, and I looked up at the radios, and the wrong frequencies were set in. And I looked at the heading bug, the wrong heading was set in. And so I asked the co-pilot, I said, I think you've got the wrong plate up. We're supposed to be flying into this airport in this approach. And he very aggressively shoved his book in my face and said, no, this is the airport, this is the approach. You're right, I'm right, you're wrong. And so I spent about 30 seconds thinking, gosh, did I screw this up? And I'm looking at the date on my book, making sure it wasn't expired, making sure I did have the right airport pulled up, and trying to figure out if I had made that mistake. When suddenly the radio comes alive, and it's the approach controller, and he says, NASA 962, you've just flown through the localizer, you're 2 miles off course, state your intentions. Okay, and if we had been flying in bad weather, in mountainous terrain, we could have been one of those statistics, and people would have said, how did an entire flight crew allow the airplane to fly into a mountain? That's exactly how. And that was a very important lesson for me. I was really angry at my colleague, another astronaut, not just only because he was being a jerk, but I was actually more mad at myself for allowing that to happen. So that was a very important lesson for me, that if I think that something is not right in an operational situation like that, in a critical operation, I'm going to really make myself heard and make sure that we get it sorted out. And like I said, that's how entire flight crews fly into mountains. And more than once, this has happened. And people often, in the aftermath, they can't figure out, how did this entire flight crew do that? And that's how it happens. So the operational decision making means that we have a saying for that. You work what's going to kill you first. Okay, so prioritize your problems. When we're in the simulators, the instructors or masters are throwing malfunctions at us that pile up on each other, and be easy to make a mistake and work the wrong thing, and then the other thing kind of sneaks up on you and gets you, right? So you're constantly reprioritizing as you go about what you're going to work next and what's important, and that's going to shift, right? So another thing is use the help that you might have. We always have the Mission Control Center, but you also have to be careful that you abdicate control lightly. If you're at the pointy end of the spear, you're the one that's on the scene, and your team is the one that has the most up-to-date information and has the insight into what's going on. So use your help, but don't give up control unless you think you're really lost and you kind of need someone else to take over. Another example of that, a personal example of that, we were flying to the International Space Station. So this is my 4th flight. We're in a Russian Soyuz spacecraft. We're approaching the station, and we just crossed the 200-meter point, so we're getting very close. And suddenly all the bells and alarms and whistles start going off. And usually, like I said, this doesn't happen on flight day. Usually on flight day, everything's in the green. It's very nice and quiet. It's only in the simulators during training that the alarms and the lights are always going off, right? So first thing I thought is, I can't believe this. This doesn't happen except in the simulator. But then we jumped right into action here. What had happened is that we'd had a failure in our autopilot. It started speeding us up towards the station instead of slowing us down, and it also started a left rotation, so we started losing visual sight of the station. Very dangerous combination. So we got took manual control, went through the emergency procedures, and got the ship stopped 50 meters from the station, and had a big conversation with the Russian Mission Control Center. They wanted us to go back into automatic, and we said, well, why would we do that? That's what caused the problem in the first place, and they were insistent. And so, my Russian crewmate, Saljan Sharipov, he was the commander of the Soyuz spacecraft, and I was the co-pilot. So we looked at each other, and he nodded, and so I put the vehicle back into automatic, and immediately the problem started again with all the alarms, and we started approaching the station again, and without being told, put us back into manual control, and he got us steady. And we looked at each other again, and we kind of, without speaking, we both agreed we're not doing that again, no matter what the ground says. And so after another conversation, we successfully completed the first night manual docking to the ISS. And it's one of those things where you're trained so well that you do everything right, but then after you're safely docked, you take a deep breath, and then that's when the little hairs on the back of my neck stood up, because that was really a dangerous situation. If we had hit the station, we almost certainly would have been lost, and we could have easily ripped a hole in the station and taken care of everyone else on board as well. So as I mentioned before, sometimes you don't have much time to think and you've got to rely on your instincts, you know. And an example of that was Gemini 6. Wally Schirra, one of the first original 7 astronauts, he was the commander of that mission. And just moments after ignition, after T0, the engine shut down. And so what had happened is the explosive bolts that hold the vehicle on the launch pad had already blown. And so the rocket was just sitting there on its own and, you know, was very likely would have toppled over and exploded. And so the proper procedure is for the crew to eject themselves from that. Now, ejection, of course, comes with its own risks. And, you know, but Wally, trusting his instincts, felt that the rocket was not going to fall over. So he did not give the command to eject. And they were able to save the vehicle and get it secured down and save the spacecraft to fly another day. On the other side of the world, in Russia, this is Soyuz T-10A, and moments before launch, there was a fire in the first stage, and the fire spread so quickly that it burned through the wires that normally would have commanded the escape tower to fire to pull the crew and the capsule away to safety. And so a quick-thinking launch director in the bunker, he was able to send a radio command to initiate the abort and get the crew away from the exploding rocket. And it was, you know, this was another thing that there's no time to react. In just seconds, the whole rocket exploded, and fortunately the crew got away safely. So the worst thing that happened to me in space, I'll give you a chance to look at this diagram. Maybe you can figure out what system this is aboard the space station. Some of you might have figured out that this is the toilet system, right? So one Friday evening, we'd finished our work, finished our conference, and we were getting ready to kind of relax. And when suddenly the most awful smell you can imagine starts coming up into the cabin, like, what is that? Right? And so we started looking behind panels to see what was going on, and we took up one of the floorboards, and there was this awful green goo that came floating up into the cabin. And so we didn't have time to think about this. We didn't have time to call the Mission Control Center. We just reacted, and so we got out dirty laundry, and we started, you know, corralling these green globules that smelled awful. We could feel it was something acidic because it was burning our hands, but we didn't have time to get goggles and put gloves on, which is what the Mission Control Center would have told us to do. And we got it all under control, and what had happened was there was a failure in the bathroom system. And what happens is in the system, after you use it, it automatically flushes the line. A pump turns on, flushes the lines with concentrated sulfuric acid to kind of keep everything clean. And unfortunately, the motor had stuck on, and so the pump emptied its entire tank of sulfuric acid, flooding the system, overflowing it with all the nastiness in it, and those were the green globules that we had to clean up. So that was the worst thing that happened to me in space. Pretty unpleasant. Well, with all these problems, why would anyone fly into space? Well, now I'm going to flip it over and spend a few minutes showing you some of the fantastic views from space. You know, I don't think anyone flies into space without some pretty serious introspection and thinking about what life is all about and what's important. So I just want to show you a few pictures that I shot. I shot over 16,000 photos aboard the ISS when I was there. Here's some of my favorites. This is looking over the Himalaya mountains into China. And from our perch of about 280 miles up, the Himalayas, the snow-capped mountains look pretty small. But just remember, you know, that down there somewhere is Mount Everest, the tallest peak on the Earth. Here's some different places from around the world. This is Mecca in Saudi Arabia. The white spot in the middle of the screen, that's the Grand Mosque where the annual pilgrimage occurs. Here's Beijing, the capital of China. Light snowfall helping bring out some of that detail. That rectangle in the middle, that's the Forbidden City where the old emperors used to live. Here's Seoul, South Korea at night. You can see the river running through the middle of the city. You can see the street lights defining some of the major streets. Here's downtown Houston. You can see what's possible with some handheld photography. This is, you know, in space we're traveling pretty fast. I mentioned before 17,500 miles an hour. That works out to almost 5 miles every second. So as you take photographs, you have to learn to pan the target, track the target as you release the shutter, and you have to focus. Even though we're about 280 miles away, you can't just stick the camera in the window and shoot because the image will smear and appear blurry. So you have to focus. And remember, you're weightless, so you better use your feet to hold on to something. You're just going to float away from the window. But with a little bit of practice, you can get pretty good. This is New Orleans. This was taken before the hurricane. Downtown, this is Manhattan Island, of course, New York City. Again, so you can see some of the details you can get on a clear day with some good lighting conditions. Here's the southern tip of Florida. South Florida and the Bahamas are unlike anywhere else in the world. The blues and greens just really jump out at you. This is what it really looks like out the window. Here are glaciers in Patagonia in Argentina. Here are the Great Pyramids at Giza. You can see the two big ones pretty clearly. If you look down from the two big ones, you can see the third smaller one. And just to the left of the third smaller one, you can make out the outline of the Sphinx. Here's an area in the Ukraine. I'm not sure what they were up to over there. Most unusual green you can imagine, made for a pretty picture, but I guess it kind of makes me wonder what they were up to and what it was doing to the environment. Here's another one of my favorites. This is Lake Nasser in Sunglint. So I was able to shoot this photo when the sun was reflecting at just the right angle, almost perfectly off the surface of the water into the camera lens, and it was brightly lit up just like this. This is, again, what it really looked like out the window just for a moment. Sometimes Mother Nature's just funny. I saw this in January, grabbed a camera, and had the perfect thing to send down for Valentine's Day. Well, life is full of surprises, you know, no matter how much you prepare, and I don't think any organization prepares as much as NASA thinking of all the things that can go wrong. You're going to get surprised. As I mentioned, that operational way of thinking, that's what's going to get you through. One more story. We were in our Soyuz spacecraft coming home. Very happy to be coming down, and after 6.5 months in space. So we came down and we landed. The Soyuz, of course, the shuttle had wings, and so you could land on a runway. Soyuz, of course, lands with a big bump. Even though we have soft landing rockets that fire about 3 feet off the ground, you land with a big thump. And we have other shock absorbing mechanisms, so it doesn't really hurt, at least not too much. And as sometimes happened, we tipped over, which, you know, is kind of uncomfortable, but it's usually not a big deal. Well, the way the capsule was oriented, when we tipped over, I was kind of on the upper side of the people inside, and I shifted in my suit. And so we had so much stuff crammed in the capsule that my helmet, the top of my head was kind of pushed up against this bag of stuff. And then my shoulders were pinching off the lines that were blowing air over my face, right? And so I could notice the carbon dioxide was building up. We were in radio contact with the rescue forces outside. They were getting ready to open the hatch probably in a few minutes. But so I decided, okay, no big deal. I'm going to unlatch the visor of my helmet and raise the visor so that I can breathe, right? And so this is another lesson about operational decision making and the way of thinking is that you don't panic. You never freak out. You just keep working the problem as quickly and logically as you can. And so I unlocked my visor and unlatched it, but I couldn't push it up because my head was crunched up against this box of stuff. And so I thought, okay, well, no big deal. I will undo my harness and I will fall on top of the other guys, and that won't make them happy, but at least I'll be able to open my visor. So I undid my harness, but I had my knee harnesses still attached, and I'd shifted so much that I couldn't actually reach the releases for those harnesses because there were other things in the way, and now under the weight of gravity I couldn't get to it. And so that's when I cursed myself and said, why didn't I think about bringing a knife with me? And I could have cut those straps, but you know, oh well. Now we got to think some more. So by this time my visor was completely fogged up, and I could feel the carbon dioxide giving me a headache. I undid one of my gloves. I thought, okay, maybe I can get some air through my arms. Undid my glove, but I fit so tightly in the suit that there was nothing getting past my arms. So I started thinking, having thoughts about, okay, let's see, how many more minutes before they open the hatch? If I pass out, how long will I be out? How much brain damage do you think will occur? You know, things like that, not pleasant thoughts. Here everyone on the ground who's watched the landing is celebrating because we've returned safely. Not knowing that here I am, I'm thinking, my goodness, here I am, after all we've been through, coming down, and now I'm going to suffocate in my suit. Great. And so finally I was able to wedge one fingernail under my visor and lift it up about 1/8 of an inch, and that cool breeze that came in was really wonderful. So fortunately for the kid, it worked out okay, and I was able to kind of work my thumb under there and keep that visor open until the rescue forces could come in and with their knives cut me out of my seat and get me out of the vehicle. So again, you've got to stay calm and work the problem. So I talked about these leadership principles that were succinctly put together by General Schwarzkopf. They're not new concepts. I know you've heard all of these before, but hopefully I've given you a little bit different of perspective to think about them, and maybe that'll help you be a little creative with your own organizations and your own groups that you're leading and how you might want to do things a little bit differently. Training, again, I can't emphasize enough how important training is. Think of it as a lifelong commitment. The old adage in flying is train like you fly and fly like you train. And that's what's going to help you get through when you're surprised, right? Because again, no matter how much you prepare, you're going to come into situations that surprise you. And if you work the problems methodically, calmly, then that's going to get you through to a safe landing. Finally, again, use help. Use all the resources available to you, but give up control lightly. Don't give up control without much thought. Because if you're on the pointing end of the spear, it's not only you're behind that's on the line, but you usually have the best data and information, and you're the one that should make those on-the-scene decisions. So this is the last photo I want to leave you with. This, of course, is the moon. I shot this from the space station using the long lens. It was the moon that inspired me all those years ago to want to become an astronaut myself. On the left side, Mother Earth, home planet to all of us, and that blue in the middle is what surprised me the most the first time I flew into space. I looked back at the Earth and was almost overcome by how beautiful it was and how bright the colors were. Then I saw that the sunlight passing through our atmosphere causes it to glow, these beautiful shades of blue. So this picture to me says dreams, and that's where it all begins, right? Everything begins with a dream. And so for me, that was space flight. That started as an 8-year-old. And so I always encourage people to think about what they'd like to do in the future, because the main thing is to be proactive, take control of your life, and guide it the way you think you want it to go. And remember these lessons, the operational decision-making, the leadership, and I hope you've enjoyed this presentation. Thank you for your indulgence, and I wish you a very best rest of the conference. Thank you very much. Okay, so we've got questions. Okay, I'm going to see if I can read these. Let's see. So John is asking, traveling to space with another country probably highlighted leadership challenges from cultural differences. How did you resolve these challenges in spaceflight? Yes, that's a very great question, because spending time in Russia, we really got to learn the culture there, and it's very different, as you can imagine. So one of the things that surprised us the most, Americans, when we first go over to Russia, is the way that they deal with each other in these meetings. And so the Americans are kind of shocked because, at NASA, we're, pretty conscientious and polite and all that. In a meeting in Russia, there's a lot of confrontation and conflict. People are raising their voices and getting up out of their seats. And so we're kind of a little bit taken aback. And so, but then after the meeting's over and the decisions have been made, everything's fine. These people are still all friends. They still go out and have a drink together. It's no big deal. And so as an American, I kind of had to learn to be a little more aggressive in those situations, more so than I would be at NASA. In fact, it's kind of funny. The leadership at NASA would keep wondering what's wrong with these Americans that go over to spend time in Russia. They come back into these aggressive, kind of jerks. So you have to remember to turn back into an American when you come back to the U.S. But then I learned as a leader and the commander of this mission, that when I was over there dealing with an issue with the training team or with preparation, I kind of had to be a little more aggressive than I was used to being in the U.S. So that's just one example of things that you have to kind of adjust as you do deal with these different people from different cultures. All right, let's see. So Danielle is asking, what is the most significant failure you've worked through with your team? Well, the biggest emergency was the one I described, coming into dock with the station. But the challenge, there was not one particular thing during the preparation. And by the way, the leadership really comes in during the training, during the years of training and preparation. That's where you really have to be able to manage all these different organizations the best you can, because as the commander of the mission, I wasn't the general in charge per se. I had a whole training team to work with. I had a mission control team to work with, mission management team. And so, we all had to kind of figure things out together. And so you've got to, cooperate, get, everybody lined up in the right direction, the same direction. And so that was really the biggest challenge. And so, for example, when we had things that had to be worked, like I didn't feel like we were getting all of the equipment that we needed, then I had to kind of talk to these different organizations about priorities and seeing if we could get some more of these different tools that I thought we would need. And so there are a lot of kind of day-to-day things like that take some effort. Also interfacing with the Russian training team. Well, I think, this person needs a little more training on, say, EVA, on spacewalking, so then negotiating with their training people to get time to go and do, to add something into the schedule. And so there was just these, a lot of these little day-to-day things that as the kind of the leader of the crew, I had to kind of advocate and try to cajole these different organizations to agree to give us what I thought we needed. Okay, let's see. Mark is asking, what did you think of the movie The Martian as it applies to decision-making and risk assessment? I think The Martian was actually pretty well done until the very end when it kind of became a little bit too unreal. But yeah, I think it shows the decision-making of the astronaut that was left behind and figuring out, okay, here's what I have to do, here are the resources I have, and how am I going to use these to my advantage to try to sustain myself as long as I can until these people figure out that I'm still here and figure out how to come and get me, right? So I think that was a perfect example, actually, a very nice example of the things that I've talked about today of operational decision making and not panicking and not freaking out, but just taking stock of your situation and logically trying to figure out what you can do about it. Okay, Ray says, what is reentry to Earth like? What is the biggest challenge to returning home? You know, reentry is not anything like the movies. You know, in the movies, I mean, you're vibrating. It's all this stress and G-forces. Yeah, they're G-forces, and there's a little bit of vibration, but it's not nearly as bad in the movies. You just kind of slip into the atmosphere, and, you know, you're using friction alone to slow down, so that's why you have a heat shield. So from slowing down from those high speeds, you know, the heat shield gets up to about 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit, and that's enough to develop a plasma around the capsule or around the space shuttle. And so you're kind of enveloped in this pinkish orange glow. And it's in the case of the capsule, the Soyuz capsule, it uses what we call an ablative heat shield. So it dissipates the heat by burning away. And so bits of flaming heat shield are going by the porthole here, which sounds a little disconcerting, but that's what it's supposed to do. And so it really isn't as violent as they show in the movies. We did get up to about 5 Gs on the capsule coming down, but there wasn't a sustained 5 Gs. It was kind of it would ramp up and then go back down, ramp up and go back down into what we call these fugoids as we enter the atmosphere. And so it wasn't really too bad. You know, it's a little more of an effort to breathe when you're under all those Gs, which feels like someone's sitting on your chest, but it's not too bad. All right, let's see. Alan is asking, how has your drive to do great things affected your leadership skills? Did it make it easier to be a leader or more difficult? Well, I'll tell you what, you know, we all know these people who are natural born leaders. I can tell you I definitely was not one of those. I had to learn how to do it. And so I learned a lot from the commanders that I had during my shuttle missions. And one commander in particular I flew with twice, Colonel Brian Duffy, who's an Air Force pilot. And he had a leadership style that I really admired. He was not the dictatorial type. He really would kind of coax you to go in the right direction, the way that he thought you ought to go. And so I really learned a lot from him. And as I mentioned, you look around at some of the other people that I served under or was, you know, had bosses in different jobs, and I learned a lot about what not to do, some of the examples that I talked about in the beginning. And leadership, again, is something that you continue to refine. You know, I read things. You know, really enjoyed reading about about General, you know, Schwarzkopf and some of his thoughts on leadership. And as I said, I think he's one of the best leaders of our modern time. And Madura is asking, how has your perspective towards life changed after being in space? Yeah, there's something that a term was coined just a few years ago called the overview effect. And that was not around earlier in my career, but it kind of sums it up perfectly. Even after my first mission of 2 weeks in space, I got this perspective from seeing the Earth from orbit. The Earth looks so beautiful and peaceful from space, you know. But of course, intellectually, we knew there were problems on the ground. There were people suffering, even the areas we were flying over at that moment. There was war, famine, you know, human suffering. And so it was kind of hard for me to kind of reconcile that dichotomy in my mind. And so what it gave me is a deeper appreciation for life. And it made me realize that the small things I used to get irritated by just weren't important. You know, so nowadays, if there's something going on, the first question I ask is, well, is someone, you know, seriously hurt or worse? Well, no. Okay, well, then everything else we can kind of figure out. You know, we can get around just about everything else. And so it kind of gave me that perspective. I used to be the kind of person that would get irritated if I felt I'd been cheated somehow or shortchanged. But now I've learned that, you know, none of that is really important. I've learned to let that go. All right. Chris is asking, understanding that preparation can be important in any sort of decision making, can you over-prepare in a way that it results in less effective decision-making? Yeah, so I think an example of that would be, well, first of all, I don't think you can over-prepare. You know, I mean, I guess you don't want to obsess about it to the point where you're neglecting something else that you should be figuring out. But you know, when you are so prepared, that lays that foundation, like I said, to allow you to improvise when you get surprised, and you will be surprised. So no, I don't think you can over-prepare, but at the same time, you don't want to get locked into a certain way of doing things. You have to be able to think, well, wait a minute, that's one thing they train us very well on at NASA, is you can't just blindly follow the emergency procedures or the off-nominal procedures, because sometimes there's something else going on that if you just do that, you're going to make the problem worse. Right? That's another adage we had, is think about what you're doing, because you can always make the problem worse. And so if you over-prepare and you're just going to blindly follow the checklist, that's not right either. You've got to keep that bigger picture, that perspective, to allow you to think about the consequences of each step you're going to take. Okay, another Chris asks, thank you for your service. Having spent a considerable time of space, what do you appreciate most about life on Earth? Well, I'll tell you, that's what I missed the most about the Earth when I was gone. We had that beautiful view of all parts of the Earth, but I missed being down in it. I missed nature. I missed the smell of grass, the feel of the wind. I missed hearing birds chirp and squirrels run around. That's what I really missed the most. Danielle asks, what is the hardest thing about reacclimating to Earth after being in space for extended periods of time? Even after a short shuttle mission, you come back down and your body's already adapted to space, even after a week or two. And so your balance system, your brain doesn't know what to do with the signals coming from your balance system. So you get very dizzy. That can make it difficult to walk a straight line, make it very uncomfortable to even stand up. It can make you nauseous. And so that's the biggest effect that you notice right away. There are other effects too, like even though you've been exercising and working out every day, those muscles aren't necessarily exactly the ones you use for walking. Some people have complained about their neck muscles get sore when they come back after a long flight, because they haven't had to work to keep your head upright for 6 months or more. And so those are some of the symptoms that can occur. We have other more subtle changes to biomedically. There are a lot of challenges biomedically to long-duration spaceflight. In fact, that's the biggest technical challenge we have to solve before we can send a crew to Mars. You probably have seen in the news over the years, astronauts have been coming back with effects on their eyes. In fact, over 70% of astronauts who fly these long flights come back with some kind of effect on their vision. And so I was one of the lucky ones that didn't have any problems, but some have come back with permanent eye damage. And so we really need to get a handle on this and develop what we call countermeasures before we can start thinking about sending crews to Mars. Okay, and Greg is asking, what is your review related to the recent reports of UFO observations? So UFO observations are nothing new. I remember I was flying with astronaut John Young, kind of the astronaut's astronaut, several years ago. And he was telling me a story about flying back from the Cape in a T-38 jet and looking up and seeing something just zooming past him, and it had these little puffs behind it. And so, that could definitely be classified as a UFO, right? But, what it probably was a pulse jet. And so we were experimenting with pulse jets in the 60s and 70s and hypersonic pulse jets. They're probably still classified. We probably still don't really know about them in the public. And so for me, these UFO sightings are probably secret classified programs, flying programs, aircraft programs, or hypersonic vehicles. And so we will, maybe we'll find out about them someday, but maybe they'll remain classified for, many years to come. I don't know, but I don't think they're visiting spacecraft from outside of our solar system. Having said that, I do believe there's other life out there. In fact, I believe there's life all over the universe, even intelligent life, but we're never going to find each other because we're just so far apart. We're likely, something like hundreds of millions of light years apart. Just think about how vast the universe is. And so in no way do I believe that we are the only intelligent life in the universe, but I don't think they found us, and I don't think we're going to find them. Okay, Emily is asking, where is the best place to gain more knowledge on emerging technologies and tech skills necessary for a future commercialized space exploration? I don't know if there's any one place that's the best place to go, but being computer people, the internet is full of information. Of course, you got to put your filters on and only pull information from reputable sites. But that's probably the best place to get public domain information. Just go start searching around. One of my favorite, full disclosure, I am a consultant for SpaceX, but one of the most exciting companies, I think, is SpaceX. All the things that they're doing, they've really stood the launch industry on their head. And there's a lot of information out there about their programs, about the new Starship that's being designed and built and developed. that Elon Musk says one day will be used to take people, up to 100 people at a time to and from Mars, right? And by the way, I believe Elon Musk is hosting Saturday Night Live on Saturday, so I might have to tune in and see what he has to say. Okay, Trevor is saying, when dealing with conflict in the workplace, what would be the most important thing to do after the conflict has occurred to keep work a productive environment? Right, so when I say you've got to have conflict, I don't mean like coming to blows literally, but having let's have a sit down and let's talk this problem through and let's figure it out. Let's figure out how we can both be happy or at least both be satisfied or everyone in this group. And so hopefully that, you can come to some compromises and then you can, okay, as the leader say, okay, well, this is what we're going to do. This is going to be the best solution for all of us. Now, nobody's going to be perfectly happy with it, but I expect everyone to march to these decisions, and this is where we're going to go, and we're going to move forward, and everyone's going to keep working together. So that's the best you can do, and I think that's very important to do that instead of, like I said, unfortunately, some leaders will just ignore the problem or delegate it to someone else or, just kind of let it fester, and that's the worst thing you can do. Okay, let's see. What's next here? Chase, what are your thoughts on black holes? Well, they're definitely out there. We've observed them, and recently some astronomers have actually taken pictures of them, which is pretty amazing. And so they're hard to imagine, hard to wrap your head around a black hole, but apparently they're all around the universe. And so fortunately, we're nowhere near any black holes. Otherwise, it could be curtains for us. But pretty fascinating phenomena out there in the universe. Okay, Sarah's asking, how do you gain buy-in for your direction or guidance when others don't want to listen? Any tips? For example, co-pilot off course. Right, so as a leader, you have to be able to, you earn the respect of your teammates, right? And so you do that by some of the principles that General Schwarzkopf talked about, having that character and integrity and always doing the right thing and leading by example, setting those high standards for yourself so that people want to follow you, they want to listen to you. Now, you're always going to get people that maybe have their own ideas and they're not going to listen to you no matter what. That's when it's appropriate to have a one-on-one and have that conflict that I talked about. And like I said, not coming to blows, but sitting down and saying, look, what's it going to take, for you to get on board? And sometimes you're going to have those cases where this person just isn't going to work out, and it's time to see if you can transfer that person to another place. Hopefully you don't have to do that, but that's going to happen. Okay, so coming from a diverse background myself, this is Nikita. I am curious if being diverse has impacted your career, your decision-making, and leadership style. Absolutely. I kind of briefly mentioned that, I grew up in two cultures, one foot in the American culture and one in the Chinese culture, and that gave me a lot of perspective and helped me a lot. And then through my international travels and training with the Japanese astronauts, with Europeans, and then my extensive training with the Russians, all that perspective has really helped me a lot. It gives me, I got to the point where when I landed in Moscow, I felt like a Russian. And I started thinking like a Russian. I started doing things the way they do it. And so when we would discuss world events that were going on, that the U.S. and Russia weren't necessarily in line with their thinking, I could understand their perspective based on their history and based on their historical relationship with the country that they were backing. So it definitely helps a lot. Okay, and I think we have time for one more. Alan's asking, what advice would you give to someone who's interested in becoming an astronaut? When I talk to young people who want to become astronauts, I have the same advice for them no matter what they want to do. I said, number one, do the very best you can in school. Take it seriously, study hard. The difference a lot of times, and certainly was true in my case, is that it's the hard work and the perseverance that's going to make the difference. Okay, it doesn't guarantee success, but that's going to be hopefully an enabling thing, is getting a good education, getting good grades. The other important thing, just as important, is to take care of your health. Take care of your physical health. Take care of your mental health. Work hard in school, but also take care of your body, because if you're feeling good and you're healthy, well, then your mind is going to perform at its peak as well. So it's a very simple recipe, no matter if you want to become an astronaut or anything else. All right, I think we're about out of time, but again, I'd like to thank you for participating today, and thanks for all the great questions. Sorry we couldn't get to all of them, but best of luck to all of you, and good luck.